Our next speaker is Mary Ann Franks, who is an associate professor of law at the University of Miami School of Law and the legislative and tech policy director and vice president of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. She has advised legislators in the US and the UK in drafting laws against the non-consensual distribution of sexually explicit images and has worked with major tech companies to create policies to combat cyber harassment. The respondents are Erica Rackley, Professor of Law at the University of Birmingham, and Sigríður Friðjónsdóttir, Attorney General. Mary is going to talk about women's online rights. Mary, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here to talk to you today about women's online equality. And I'm going to start today with something fairly obvious and something that I know everyone in this room is already aware of. The fact that for most of world history, women have not, in fact, been equal, that they have been denied their basic civil rights in many explicit ways, many state-sponsored ways with which we are all familiar, including, of course, the right to vote, the right to own property, the right to pursue employment and educational opportunities, which have led to the loss of other rights, such as a right to privacy and a right to freedom of expression. That these are all things that we are all familiar with in the explicit state-sponsored way in which women have been denied equality over the years. We also know that there are certain categories or certain classical reasons for why women have been denied these rights, that women's inequality has been justified according to many, many different paradigms, but there are three basic categories I think that we can speak of when talking about women's inequality. One is to say that whatever inequality women experience is natural, that it has to do with the fact that women are biologically set up for certain types of characteristics, that perhaps men's tendency to violence is natural, so that we have a response to many of the things that women experience as merely the way nature has set things out to be. Another way of approaching women's inequality is to talk about it as being trivial. So we're very familiar with this, of course, in the domestic violence context, the sexual assault context, sexual harassment context, the response being that whatever harms women are experiencing, they're just not as serious as real harms, property harms, harms that could also happen to men. We've also been told that women's harms are deserved. That is, if women are in fact experiencing sexual assault, sexual harassment, this must be because women themselves have done something wrong, classic victim blaming. That these are three categories that we often use to justify where women are or where women are not, and that sometimes all three of these categories can be brought to bear on these issues and these discussions of women. Now, of course, as much of this conference has already discussed, there's been a lot of progress. We're not where we were, many forms of progress all throughout the world, right? But most of this progress has been geared towards formal, explicit inequality. And so we are lucky, all of us, to live in a world, relatively speaking, that is not necessarily dominated by formal, explicit, state-sponsored inequality, but that many problems remain. One of the things I want to focus on in this presentation is the role that the internet is supposed to have played in this progress. And what I want to suggest is that at least for a time, at least for a brief moment in the late 80s and the 90s, there was a sense in which the internet was seen as a kind of utopia, that we were going to have a revolution through the internet. And it wasn't just going to be a general revolution of speech and communication for everyone. It was going to be specifically beneficial for women's equality. It was going to be specifically beneficial for advancing some of the women's rights that had not been advanced in the past. And what was the theory behind this internet revolution? There were lots of theories, and I'm just going to oversimplify some of them here, which is to say that the vision of the internet, early on at least, was that it was going to be text-based. That is to say, it was going to be about language. It was going to be about pure communication. It wasn't going to be about appearance. It wasn't going to be about embodiment. It was actually going to be a release from embodiment. We were going to be able to escape our bodies, and women in particular were going to benefit from that because women, so often, their inequality was tied to their embodiment. The fact that they had bodies to be assaulted, to be beaten, to be objectified, this was essential to the problem of women's inequality. So the internet had this possibility as being a terrain of the mind, as it was often called. It was going to have this potential to liberate those people whose embodiment played a key role in their subordination. And it was going to provide a way for people to communicate and express themselves without having to be judged on the basis of their appearance for whatever that might mean. That was the idea. One of the most compelling statements or most poignant statements about what the internet was supposed to do and what it was envisioned as having the capability of doing comes from, well, I'll give you the quote first and I'll tell you who said it afterwards, but it's an extraordinary quote. "We are creating a world that all may enter without privilege or prejudice accorded by race, economic power, military force, or station of birth. We are creating a world where anyone, anywhere may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence or conformity." This is John Perry Barlow, who is the co-founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which continues to be a remarkably influential force in internet technology and freedoms. This is the Declaration of Independence in Cyberspace from 1996. Barlow was also a lyricist for the Grateful Dead, you could maybe tell. This vision, though, I think is actually an extraordinary vision. This idea that the internet was going to be this place where people could communicate, could really be intellectually discoursing with each other and not being based on embodiment. But I want to point out a few things. When you notice the privileges and prejudices that Barlow names, race, economic power, military force, or station of birth, there is something missing. There's no reference made here to gender at all. And that might have been merely a rhetorical oversight, but what has happened through and with the internet since then points this up in a very significant way. What has actually happened in terms of women specifically having the freedom to express themselves in any way they would like without the fear of being pushed into silence or conformity? And this points up a question, I think, about those people who were the architects of the internet themselves, those people who were giving us the rhetoric and the structures of the internet. Who were they, and what were they worried about? What were they aware of? That despite the rhetoric which was actually quite extraordinary in many ways, the actual technicians behind the internet, the fathers of cyberspace, if you want to call them that, were mostly male, mostly white, mostly middle class. So what did that mean? It doesn't mean, of course, that they're bad people. It means that they have certain priorities in mind. They have certain values in mind. And it also means they had certain values and certain problems and certain issues very much not in mind, including real material analysis of status quo discrimination and inequality. As beautiful as that rhetoric is in the Declaration of Cyberspace, it's not actually a very politically concrete manifesto. It just says generally we're being oppressed and we're not going to be oppressed. We're not going to be oppressed when we enter cyberspace. But were these men actually being oppressed, or were they actually the men in society who had the most power and privilege already and were staking out a new frontier? So what you get, I would suggest, is certain selective interpretations of certain types of values, principally because the people who actually were in charge of the internet, if we can call it that, and it's something that becomes with every passing year more difficult to talk about, the internet as a structured thing, a made thing, especially for those who were born into a world that was always, where the internet always was. It's getting increasingly difficult not to see it as an extension of nature. But it isn't, of course. It was created by people. It was created, in fact, by governments. And so this is important for us to know and to think about who it is who put those structures into play and what they cared about. And what they cared about, I would suggest, is not material inequality, certainly not material gender inequality. And so that we get these values and these rhetorical commitments to things like free speech and privacy, but they are concepts that are principally designed to shore up the power of those who already have power. So we have to take a step to think about what is actually online, what has the internet done, and there's lots of ways to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about it in a fairly abstract way, but just to think about what the internet has done for us and what is actually going on out there. Every single minute, Google receives over 4 million search queries, every single minute. Every minute, Facebook users share nearly 2.5 million pieces of content. Every minute, Twitter users tweet nearly 300,000 times. Instagram users post nearly 220,000 new photos. YouTube users upload 72 hours of new video content. Email users send over 200 million messages. This is all happening every minute. It's a lot of content and a lot of communication. But perhaps a more important question is, who's online? 42.4% of the world's population uses the internet. That's either very high or very low, depending on your frame of reference. 86.9% of North America, I've come to understand that it's much higher in Iceland, something above 95%. 64% of Americans own a smartphone, so actually carrying the internet around with them everywhere they go. Google has 2.4 billion users. Facebook has 1.2 billion. Twitter has 288 million monthly active users, and for some inexplicable reason, Snapchat has 100 million users. Lots and lots of people are using technology and the internet. But closer look, who's online? 200 million more men have access to the internet than women do. Now that breaks down in lots of very interesting ways, which I'll have to skip through rather quickly. 41% of men compared to 37% of women. In the so-called developed world, those numbers are slightly different from those of the so-called developing world. But the really important thing is not just who is actually online, although that gap is very important. It's also important to think about how, in some time that has passed since the 1990s, who is actually developing those platforms? Who is actually developing the search engines? Who is actually developing the structure of this thing we call the internet and that has become inextricably intertwined with most of our lives? And the answer is men. 90% of all tech employees are male. 90%. When we talk about leadership positions, senior positions, the extremely influential positions, that's 96% at senior levels are male. This, I would suggest, is important in understanding the structure and the nature of the internet. It's important in understanding the structure and the nature of equality and whose values are truly valued. Amanda Hess wrote a piece, Why Women Aren't Welcome on the Internet, in 2014. She's an American journalist, and she tries to describe some of the harassment that she has received online as a woman. And she quotes this particular person who is threatening her and says, he says to her, "I'm happy to say we live in the same state. I'm looking you up, and when I find you, I'm going to rape you and remove your head. You're going to die, and I'm the one who's going to kill you. I promise you this." She's explaining this to the police officer who goes to take her report. She explains all of this, and then she describes the police officer's response. He anchors his hands on his belt, he looks me in the eye, and he says, "What is Twitter?" She points out that there's another problem here, right? There's obviously a technology gap here in certain important respects, but when she thinks harder about law enforcement, she also points out this, that only 6.5% of state police officers in the United States and 19% of the FBI agents are women. And she talks about how that actually affects the way law enforcement deals with these problems, characterizes these problems, and sees them as problems to begin with, and how this, too, is materially important for the status of women's equality. What we know, I think, many of us, is that online abuse is multiplied. Well, that is to say, technology has multiplied the capacities for abuse. And I'll go through this fairly quickly in the interest of time. That it decreases the cost of engaging in abuse, that easy-to-use technology has made it really quite rewarding and quite easy for someone to engage in abuse. It increases the benefits of engaging in abuse by giving social validation, providing crowdsourcing, and helping to make these particular industries of humiliation and harassment very profitable, from everything from spyware and tracking devices to revenge porn. And it increases the negative consequences for victims. Speaking of revenge porn as one particular issue for us to think about as a specific example of the ways that online abuse can affect women, revenge porn is a misnomer. It's non-consensual pornography would be a slightly better term, the disclosure of sexually graphic images of individuals without their consent. And that includes both images that were originally obtained without consent and those that were consensually exchanged or created and then published without the consent of the individual afterwards. So if we focus on the problems of revenge porn, just to take one example of online abuse and harassment, just to give you a sense of what some of these websites that are dedicated to revenge porn look like, this is a site called MyX. There are less explicit pictures on the front page, but if you can see that there's an area where it says nude photos, and that's where you can go and look at this woman's private photos. You can also see that the way that they get this material is through that little link up there that says, add your ex to my ex, submit a post. When you go to that form, they want to know lots of things about your ex-girlfriend. They want to know her name, they want to know where she lives, they want to know her Facebook and her Twitter as well. And this is openly soliciting this content for this very, very popular site. The scale of the problem, if you're curious, about 3,000 sites feature it, not explicitly dedicated necessarily to revenge porn, but about 3,000 do feature it. They also appear on mainstream porn sites, social media, personal blogs. Maybe as many as 1 in 10 people are threatening their partners to do this, and maybe as many as 60% are following through. The data's not great, but that's a suggestion. I'll skip through some of the other demographically interesting points of this, but according to one study that we've done, 90% of victims are female, and a lot of the personal information, such as their name, email, home address, are posted alongside the images of the majority of victims. I'm using this with permission of the person whose name comes up in these search results. This is one of the victims of revenge porn who eventually came to work for us after she had her experience. Just to give you a sense of what happens when a victim's images do get out there, every time you type her name into a search engine, these are going to be the results that attach. And those are visible results to someone's family, their friends, their potential employers, their current boyfriends. This is what anybody can see of them. I'll skip through talking about the case of Rehttindi Parsons, which is a case I know some of you have heard about, the young woman in Canada who killed herself after being sexually assaulted at a party. The images of that particular assault went viral. And following her death, her father had talked about how he didn't want her life to be defined by a Google search. He wanted to put out other memories of his daughter. But I'll skip through this for a moment so that I can conclude with something slightly less depressing, possibly, than just focusing on the fact that the impact, I think it's clear, on individuals is going to be things like domination of internet searches, economic costs of having to hire a lawyer or to have to make a police report. They are often victims threatened with sexual assault, pressured to remain in abusive relationships. They're extorted, they're stalked, they're harassed. Many of them have been forced to move from their homes, and tragically, many of them commit suicide. So this is just the impact, the negative impact on individuals themselves who are victimized by this practice. The impact on society, I would suggest, and again, moving rather quickly through this, and I apologize, is the normalization of all of these factors. Non-consensual sexual activity becomes perfectly normal, as does sexual surveillance, as does the use of punishment, as use of sex as a means of punishment and as a means of control. You do something I don't like, I release these pictures of you. Normalization of the use of sexual humiliation as a form of entertainment, that the people who are consuming this material are doing it because they like the fact that it's non-consensual. And what does all this mean? Well, it means that women's civil rights are impacted. They are afraid to express themselves. These women who are targeted in this way remove themselves from public spaces. They remove themselves from their jobs. They remove themselves from their schools. There's a lot of self-censorship because they fear bringing more attention to themselves, which leads in turn to a loss of women's voices in the workplace, in schools, in the community, which leads to, once again, domination by other interests and other people, and a replication of the status quo. We're very fond in the United States of caring mostly about state tyranny and not thinking very hard about social tyranny, and it's unfortunate because one of the leaders or one of the thinkers that we're supposed to care most about, one of the founding fathers of libertarianism, you could say, John Stuart Mill, was quite keen on this idea that social tyranny was something we had to worry about even more in some cases than state tyranny. I won't read all this out, but he notes that a social tyranny is possible, which is more formidable than most kinds of political oppression because, he says, it leaves fewer means of escape, it penetrates much more deeply into the details of life, and it enslaves the soul itself. And he said that back in 1859, pointing out that you really have to care just as much, if not more, about the way individuals can subordinate each other as much as the state can subordinate any of us. The solution. So I've got a minute and a half to talk about what we can do as a solution. Well, we need, of course, to think about putting equality into the structures of our life. And that's everything from technology to social norms to law enforcement. If we value this, we have to build it into the system. We have to develop structures that encourage fairness, serendipity, deliberation, and diversity. We have to actually think about this as a structural, architectural problem and not merely one of a rhetorical problem. And the way that we can do that, and the way that we can think about this, I'll give you one example with the organization that I work with, called the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, which was founded in 2013 by a revenge porn victim named Holly Jacobs. We have attempted to do this. This is kind of our vision, is to say we're not just going to make a policy commitment to these issues. We're not just going to make a philosophical commitment to these issues. We're going to try to attack this on every level, from law enforcement to education to actual legislation to tech companies. And so what we've done, again, I'll go through this very quickly. We've established a helpline for victims. We've established educational outreach for schools, law enforcement, and judges, and the media. We have provided pro bono legal assistance. We have written model legislation, and we've gone from 3 states in the United States that have laws against this practice to 26. We have a federal bill in the works called the Intimate Privacy Protection Act. And possibly most important, or at least most immediately having an impact, is the work that we've done with tech industry leaders to say, you have to change this. You can't just decry this. You have to actually do something to change it. And as some of you may know, Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, and Google have now all taken explicitly anti-non-consensual pornography positions and have actually implemented procedures to have it taken down. All of this is to say that one of the most important things we can think about in terms of the internet and the way that technology structures our lives and our norms and our rights is to think about it as code. There is a code to our society. There's a code literally to technology. There's a code to our laws. And all of this requires effort if we want the outcome that we desire. There's no such thing as regulation versus no regulation. There's no such thing as a utopia. There's no such thing as a law or rule-free space. If we want equality, we have to make a choice to write it into the code. And if we want women's equality in particular, we have to make sure that that is written into the code of our society, our technology, and our law. Thank you.